a city of glass and shadows, a death born from brilliance, and an invention that burned brighter than its maker. Inside a brownstone where orchids bloom and tempers spark, one man sits immovable, sifting vanity from truth, with the patience of a god and the appetite of a king. But tonight, even Nero Wolfe must confront a killer who used electricity not just to murder, but to deceive. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. You'd think by now I'd have learned not to volunteer for scientific demonstrations, but when Nero Wolfe turns down an invitation, it tends to land on my desk like a lead paperweight. This one was for the grand unveiling of a new theatrical lighting system called the Crimson Switch. Wolfe had sniffed at it as though the envelope were perfumed with ozone and idiocy. "Electricity," he declared, "is a servant best left unacknowledged, too volatile for conversation." So naturally, I went. The event was held in a midtown studio that tried too hard to look modern. Chrome railings, champagne trays, and a crowd half composed of society patrons who couldn't tell a fuse from a fig leaf. I was there as Wolfe's representative, which meant I had to look serious and try not to yawn. The inventor, Giles Hanratty, strutted around like Edison's ghost with better tailoring. The financier, George Latham, glowed from reflected wealth, and the presswoman Paula Dane glided through the room collecting quotes like butterflies. Still, even from my corner, I noticed something off. The wiring around the main switch looked newer, shinier than the rest. Somebody had polished that piece of equipment like it was about to perform. Hanratty wasn't the bashful type. The man treated the stage like a pulpit, and the audience like worshippers. He introduced the Crimson Switch, with the self-importance of a man unveiling fire to cavemen. "Gentlemen and ladies, we are about to see light as emotion," he proclaimed, and Paula Dane made sure every photographer caught his best profile. George Latham, the financier footing the bills, stood beside him wearing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He looked like a man who had invested heavily in genius, but discovered it came with a maintenance fee. Paula was the kind of woman who could sell moonlight to a lighthouse keeper, slick, smiling, and sharp enough to slice through Hanratty's ego when necessary. I did my job, observed, nodded, and tried not to trip over the hors d'oeuvres. The machine itself, a brass and glass contraption with switches like piano keys, hummed faintly even before Hanratty touched it. That's when I smelled it. Not the expected metallic tang of electricity, but something else. Ozone laced with fresh paint. Someone had been doing last-minute cosmetic work. Hanratty raised his hand dramatically. "And now, behold, the crimson of creation!" he shouted. Cameras flashed. I tightened my stance. Something told me the only thing about to light up was trouble. The switch flipped with a satisfying click. A wave of crimson light spilled across the studio, bathing everything in a surreal glow. For a heartbeat, the crowd applauded the spectacle. Then came the scream. George Latham stiffened, jerked once, and folded like a man meeting an unexpected invoice from the undertaker. His right hand still clutched the metal railing. The lights flickered, buzzed, and went black. Instinct took over. I lunged toward the device, yanking its cord from the wall socket. Someone was shouting for a doctor, someone else for a priest. The air smelled of burning fabric and panic. I knelt beside Latham, no pulse, no question, dead as a bad investment. Paula Dane clutched her pearls so tightly I thought they'd shatter. Hanratty stood frozen, staring at his invention like it had bitten him. It wasn't supposed to do that," he stammered, which was as comforting as a fox denying feathers in his teeth. The police were already on their way. Someone had dialed in faster than the current had travelled. I took a quick look around the setup. The main switch casing was slightly scorched, and there was a faint whiff of burnt metal on the handle. It was too specific to be random. Somebody had fine-tuned this accident. And if there's one thing I know, it's when a corpse has been planned for. When the uniforms arrived, they brought with them Inspector Kramer, broad, rumpled, and carrying a permanent sneer reserved especially for me. "Goodwin," he growled, "what hole did you crawl out of this time?" "Professional courtesy, Inspector. Wolfe's compliments," I said, flashing my best grin. It didn't help. Kramer stomped through the studio, barking orders and brushing off Hanratty's protests. "An accident," he declared. "Faulty insulation, maybe. Happens all the time with amateurs playing scientist." "Sure," I said, "except the insulation looks brand new and the dead man wasn't holding any tools." That earned me his patented glare. "You're not investigating, Goodwin. You're a witness. Try to act like one." I kept my mouth mostly shut after that. Mostly. When no one was watching, I stooped near the switch again and caught another whiff of that sharp, burnt metal scent. I rubbed my thumb against a faint residue on the edge of the handle, enough to pocket a tiny, darkened fragment. By the time Kramer finished his speeches and the coroner arrived, I'd already decided my next move. Wolfe might hate gadgets, but he hated unsolved murders even more, and this one smelled like both. Wolfe didn't rise when I entered. He was deep in his armchair, surrounded by the smell of Fritz's pheasant and beer foam. I gave him the short version, which, for Wolfe, means under 2 minutes. He listened in silence, his eyes half closed, face unreadable. When I reached the part about Latham's death and the burnt residue, he grunted. "An exhibition," he murmured, "of human folly compounded by technological conceit." "That's one way to say murder," I replied, fishing the small charred fragment from my pocket. "Found this on the switch handle." He took it delicately between forefinger and thumb, holding it up to the light. His nostrils flared like a bloodhound catching scent. "Archie," he said, voice low but edged with interest, "find out who designed that circuit." That was Wolfe's version of goosebumps. I leaned back, smiling. "Looks like you've caught a spark, boss." He glared. "Pfui, I detest puns." Still, I noticed he didn't hand the fragment back. When the doorbell rang that morning, it didn't sound like grief. It sounded like money. There's a difference. Grief hesitates. Money presses with confidence. I opened the door to find a woman who could have walked straight out of an expensive perfume ad, except this one looked like she'd written the check for it. Black silk. Pearls understated enough to hurt, and a perfume so refined it could buy out my entire wardrobe. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, her voice smooth but clipped, "is expecting me." That was news to me. I took her in from veil to heels and filed her under trouble that tips well. "I'm afraid Mr. Wolfe rarely expects anyone," I told her. "He finds surprise a personal insult. But come in, and I'll prepare him for both you and the insult." Inside, she didn't sit. She scanned the office like it was an opponent. "I will not speak," she said coolly, "to anyone less intelligent than Mr. Wolfe." That ruled out 9/10 of Manhattan, but I managed a grin. "You're in luck, lady. There's one available, and he's between meals." Wolfe received her the way a storm receives thunder, inevitably and without enthusiasm. He sat ensconced behind his desk like a sultan surrounded by his orchids. "Madam," he began, "your name?" "Mrs. Eleanor Latham," she said, settling into the red chair with a kind of mourning that had more discipline than sorrow. "My husband, George Latham, died last evening during a public demonstration. You may have read it." I did not. Wolfe's voice was a rumble from under the mountain. "The newspaper, madam, is a compendium of vulgar catastrophes. I select my reading." She tilted her head. "Then I'll summarize. My husband was electrocuted. The police say accident. I say engineered." That got Wolfe's attention, slightly. "The inspector in charge," she continued, "has the imagination of a paperweight. I need a mind that understands motive and mathematics, preferably one that costs as much as it's worth." Wolfe's eyelids didn't flicker until she slid an envelope across his desk. The paper whispered as it went, A check inside it carried more zeros than a parade of fools. "Your police," she added, "may call it tragedy. I call it murder." Wolfe's hand, hovering above the envelope, paused mid-air like a cat debating whether to pounce. Wolfe leaned back, temples pressed against the high leather chair. "Madam," he said, "electricity bores me, and grief, when monetized, offends me." That was Wolfe for I'm interested, but pretending not to be. Mrs. Latham didn't flinch. "Offense accepted. My husband financed a scientific project, an experimental lighting system. The inventor claims sabotage. The police say mishap. I say motive." I admired her composure, no trembling lip, no theatrics, just a steady pulse of purpose under that veil. She opened a slim folder. "There are patents worth millions, and a missing schematic. My husband held the rights. Others wanted them." "Jealousy," Wolfe murmured. "A primitive motive, yet durable." She nodded. He was going to dissolve the partnership the next morning. Instead, he dissolved into a very expensive puddle of proof. I saw Wolfe's fingers stray toward the envelope again, pretending to straighten it. He glanced twice at the amount before grumbling, "Money is no substitute for sense." "No," she said softly, "but it buys access to it." That line landed like a spark in a dry field. Wolfe's eyes opened fully. When she left, the room smelled faintly of perfume and proposition. Wolfe exhaled the way men do when they're determined to be unimpressed. "Foy," he said. "Another wealthy widow seeking melodrama to alleviate loneliness." I leaned on the desk. "Sure. Only her melodrama writes 5-figure checks." He ignored me and reached for his beer. "We are not electricians, Archie, nor undertakers." "Maybe not," I said, "but when a woman like that starts shopping for answers, she won't stop until she buys one. Imagine the headlines if she tells Kramer you refused the case because electricity scared you." Wolfe froze mid-sip. His eyes opened, dark and narrowing like shutters. "Archie," he said slowly, "imbecility has many voltages. Yours is among the more stimulating." "Thanks, boss. I try to keep the current lively." He set the glass down. "Fetch the woman back before she engages an inferior mind. I detest wasted logic." I grinned. The fish had taken the bait, hook, and resistor. Mrs. Latham returned within the hour, morning as perfectly arranged as before, satisfaction flickering just beneath. Wolfe dictated terms in the tone of a man addressing a treaty: cash in advance, obedience without commentary, and no histrionics. "I will not endure emotion as evidence," he warned. She accepted each condition with a slight nod. "You will find me efficient, Mr. Wolfe." "Efficiency," he said, "is rarely feminine, but in this instance, welcome." I saw the corner of her mouth twitch, not quite a smile, but close enough. Wolfe tapped the envelope. "Madam, the electric chair was never so literal. I shall see that it claims the correct occupant." When she left, the air in the office felt charged. I pocketed the retainer, weighing it with the respect due to 10 crisp hundreds. "Case closed?" I asked. "Fui. Case switched on," Wolfe muttered. I grinned. "Then I'll stand by to throw the breaker." He gave me a glare that could have short-circuited a telephone line. By the time I reached the Midtown studio the next morning, the place already looked like a stage trying to pretend no play had ever been performed. The police tape was gone, the technicians were pretending to work, and the air smelled faintly of burnt insulation and bad conscience. I flashed Wolfe's letter of authorization with the casual authority of a man holding a royal pardon. The studio manager, a wiry fellow with nerves like a cheap wire, read it twice before deciding it wasn't worth his job to argue. The demonstration platform was spotless. Too spotless. Someone had cleaned the metal rails, polished the brass, even replaced part of the floor mat. The scorch marks from where George Latham had dropped were gone, painted over. I crouched beside the switch console and ran my finger over the handle. It came up clean, which was exactly wrong. Someone had scrubbed the evidence to a high shine. Either guilt was on the janitorial staff, or someone with a conscience had a very early morning. I made a mental note. Murderers, like bad electricians, love covering their tracks. Both end up causing another short circuit eventually. Giles Hanratty looked like he'd slept in a lightning storm and enjoyed it. His hair stuck up like it resented gravity, and his necktie had surrendered hours ago. When I introduced myself, he gave me a grin that was one spark short of sanity. Sabotage, he announced before I could open my notebook. That's what killed Latham. Sabotage by ignorance. They laughed at my polarity sequence, but it was revolutionary, I said. Yeah, they're not laughing now. He ignored the tone. Do you realize what my photonic polarity system represents? Color temperature reversal. Emotional light. Sounds cozy, I said. Except one emotion turned fatal. He pounded a fist on the table. Someone altered my circuit. I saw it before the test. Minor adjustments, they said. Optimization. Bah! That word got my attention. Who adjusted it? His eyes flickered. One of the engineers. Maybe Quinn. No, wait, perhaps... No, forget it. It doesn't matter now. Matters to me, I said. He realized what he'd said, and his face slammed shut like a vault door. I'll prove it myself, he muttered. When I reconstruct the machine, you'll see. Let's hope you don't kill the audience this time, I told him. He glared. Mr. Goodwin, art demands risk. Sure, I said. Usually not someone else's. Paula Dane was the kind of woman who could make mourning look marketable. She greeted me with a dazzling smile that didn't reach her calculating blue eyes. Ah, Nero Wolfe's man, she said, offering her hand. The manicure alone could have cut glass. Such a dreadful tragedy, isn't it? Still, they're calling it the Crimson Tragedy already. Quite evocative. That's one word for it, I said. You're turning death into copy fast. Her laugh tinkled like an expensive bell. Public interest doesn't wait, Mr. Goodwin. Besides, Mr. Latham would have wanted the publicity. He financed genius, and genius demands attention. Or headlines, I said. Depends who's buying ink. She sipped coffee, crossing legs that could have stopped traffic. Detectives always suspect motives. I assure you, I handle image, not electricity. Still, I said, you were pretty close to the fireworks. Close enough to see brilliance, she said. Close enough to smell burning silk? Her hand froze mid-air, just a fraction. Then she smiled again, too wide, too bright. I'm afraid I wouldn't know, Mr. Goodwin. I was occupied with the press. When I joked that the headlines must have been electrifying, she actually flinched. Then she changed the subject to money. That was fine by me. People who dodge questions with cash usually have something worth chasing. Ralph Quinn looked like a man who'd been wrestling guilt all night and losing on points. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes had dark rings, and his hands fidgeted like faulty wiring. I already told the cops everything, he said. The equipment tested fine. Every current was measured, every load balanced. There's no way that circuit should have failed. Unless someone crossed the lines, I said. He hesitated. That's impossible. The polarity lock prevents reversal unless someone knew how to bypass it, I finished. He blinked hard, staring at the fuse box like it might confess. I built that system, he whispered. If someone tampered with it, they did it after I left. You believe me, don't you? I don't get paid to believe, Mr. Quinn, I said. I get paid to notice things, like the fact that you keep looking at that fuse box. He flushed. Habit. I designed that too. Then you must be proud. Pride's what gets you killed, he muttered. When I packed my notebook, he followed me to the door. They'll blame me again, he said under his breath. They always do. He looked ready to collapse under a load heavier than guilt. I left him there, knowing Wolfe would want every wire of that conversation. Sergeant Piper was one of those ex-cops who had left the force but kept the chip on his shoulder. His uniform was private now, but the attitude was municipal. You were on duty the night of the demo? I asked. Yeah, locked the place after the show. No one got in after midnight. His eyes darted like minnows in a pond. I asked, "Sure about that?" He swallowed. "Absolutely. I checked every door myself." His hands trembled when he lit a cigarette. I noticed the ash shaking off before it reached the tray. "Funny," I said, "because there are fresh fingerprints near the control panel, unless you've taken up late-night tinkering." He froze. I don't know anything about that." "Somebody came back here," I said. He hesitated, then blurted, "I saw a woman leave after midnight." His voice cracked like glass. I waited. He realized what he'd just said, crushed out the cigarette, and muttered, "Forget I said that." "Sure," I said. "You'll have to remind me to forget." Before heading back, I decided to give the fuse box one last look. It was new, too new. The screws gleamed like they'd just been turned, and the labels looked printed yesterday. Someone had replaced the entire panel overnight. The smell of machine oil still clung to it. I stood there, staring at the immaculate workmanship, and felt the same unease you get when a corpse looks peaceful. Wolfe was going to like this. He enjoyed evidence that tried too hard to be innocent. Someone had rewired the crime scene, and when that happens, somebody always ends up fried. The doorbell rang like it owed me money. I opened it to find Inspector Kramer on the stoop, looking as cheerful as a thunderstorm in a fedora. His jaw was set for combat, and his coat dripped moral superiority. "Goodwin," he grunted. "Tell your boss the circus he's running just made my morning papers." I gave him my best service industry smile. "We prefer to call it an institution, Inspector. Step right in. No peanuts, no elephants, but the lions upstairs." He barged past me, trailing cigarette smoke and indignation. Wolfe, who could hear a breadcrumb fall in the kitchen, stayed in the plant rooms with his orchids. I imagined him up there, ignoring Kramer, with the dedication of a saint who's sworn off sinners. "Don't bother calling him," Kramer snapped. "I'll drag him down myself if I have to." "You'll find that difficult," I said. "Gravity's been trying for years." Kramer scowled and planted himself in Wolfe's office like an incoming storm. "Fine, I'll wait. But you tell him this. His meddling in my case stops today." The tone told me it wouldn't. When Wolfe finally descended, it was with the solemnity of a man attending his own patient's funeral. Kramer opened fire before the boss even reached his chair. "You've been sticking your nose where it doesn't belong," he barked. "That studio's my crime scene, and I won't have you turning it into a parlor game." Wolfe lowered himself into his seat, with the grace of a heavyweight lowering into a throne. "Inspector, your phrasing is as uncouth as it is inaccurate. I have not turned anything into a game. The game was already in progress. Your department merely mislaid the rules." Kramer's face went red. "You think you're smarter than the whole force, don't you?" "I think no such thing," Wolfe said smoothly. "I merely observe with regret that the force often functions without the inconvenience of thought." I sat back and enjoyed the show. There's nothing like watching Wolfe conduct verbal surgery on Kramer. It's bloodless, but you can still smell the cauterized pride. Kramer slammed a hand on the desk. "You think this was murder? It was a freak accident." "Accident?" Wolfe's voice softened. "No, Inspector. It was electrical malice. There is a difference." For once, Kramer had no comeback, just the sound of a fuse blowing somewhere in his temper. While the verbal joust continued, Kramer's aide, a thin, nervous fellow, dumped a folder of papers on Wolfe's desk. One sheet slid conveniently close to my elbow. Kramer was too busy sputtering at Wolfe's vocabulary to notice me slide a glance at it. The heading read, "Lab Analysis, Electrical Terminal, Crimson Switch." My eyes travelled down just far enough to catch a line that hummed louder than the current itself. Switch reversed. Fatal polarity. Now that was something worth pocketing. I let the corner fold into my palm like it was accidental. Wolfe, meanwhile, was offering Kramer beer to neutralise excessive amperage of temper. That nearly made the inspector detonate. I'm not drinking your fancy imported nonsense, he barked. Indeed, Wolfe murmured. Temperance is often the consolation of the unimaginative. Kramer turned to me. Does he always talk like that? Only when he's awake, I said. He glared at both of us, grabbed his hat, and stormed toward the door. As soon as it closed behind him, I unfolded the note in my pocket. One phrase sang louder than the rest. Switch reversed. Fatal polarity. The current of this case had just changed direction, and somebody was going to get shocked. Of course, the door didn't stay closed for long. Kramer came back like a boomerang with a grudge. I'm not done with you, Wolfe, he shouted. You're obstructing justice. On the contrary, Wolfe said, sipping his beer. I am merely preventing its further abuse. I'll yank that license of yours if it's the last thing I do. Do, by all means, exercise your voltage, Inspector, Wolfe replied, not looking up. It may improve your circulation. Kramer's colour deepened to the shade of overripe cranberries. I stepped in before he exploded completely and escorted him toward the door, firmly but politely. Don't worry, Inspector, I said. If we find any more corpses, I'll send you a telegram. He muttered something about frying us both before slamming the door hard enough to rattle the wall. As I straightened my tie, I glanced at the folded note in my pocket. Somebody had reversed the switch, sure, but why leave the proof lying around like a calling card? That kind of mistake wasn't an accident. It was a message. The brownstone went quiet again, but it wasn't peace. It was pressure before another storm. Wolfe sat motionless, eyes closed, fingers steepled. Polarity reversed, he murmured at last. An intellect inverted. I wasn't sure if he meant the circuit or the killer. Maybe both. Fritz's distant clatter in the kitchen broke the silence, and I realized we were already wired into the next stage of trouble. When Wolfe starts muttering about intellects, it means someone's about to find out the hard way just how fatal their own bright ideas can be. And I had a feeling the voltage was rising. It isn't every day Nero Wolfe lets me out of the brownstone without a leash and lecture, but that morning he surprised me. He was sprawled in his chair like a Roman emperor whose empire consisted of orchids, beer, and contempt for everyone else's intelligence. Archie, he said, you will make inquiries. The woman, the inventor, the engineer, and the banker. Extract, not entangle. I nodded gravely. I'll do my best to avoid entanglement, though my public has expectations. His glare could have curdled Fritz's cream. You are not to flirt. You are to extract. I grinned. With charm, of course. He grunted. Charm is treachery's twin. Exercise only what is necessary. Then, after a pause long enough to make me check if he'd fallen asleep, he added, One woman will mislead you. Another will save you. That was Wolfe, half prophecy, half warning. I pocketed my notebook and headed out, already planning to test which woman was which. The Midtown Trust Company didn't look like a place that whispered. It looked like a place that politely declined conversation altogether. But money talks, and sometimes it mumbles in ledgers if you listen right. I put on my most respectable tie and introduced myself as Archibald Goodwin, confidential auditor for the Latham estate. It's amazing how an invented letterhead and a straight face can turn vaults into open books. The teller, a young fellow with the cautious smile of a man who keeps secrets for breakfast, checked the files and found Latham's accounts. Perfectly ordinary, he said, except for the transfers to a firm called CS Holdings. How ordinary were those transfers? I asked. He hesitated. Large. How large? 250,000 large. That number could build a house, or buy a murder. He went on. Last payment cleared 2 days before Mr. Latham's death. Signed electronically by the company representative. No name, just initials. CS Holdings, I repeated. Sounds like they hold something more than stock. He smiled nervously. We don't speculate, sir. Good habit, I said, pocketing the receipt copy he'd accidentally left on the counter. Outside, I folded it into my wallet. Whoever CS was, they'd had an awfully good sense of timing and a deadly sense of investment. I found Paula Dane at a Neon diner on 43rd, wearing morning black and a lipstick shade called Profit. She was eating a cheeseburger like grief had calories. "Mr. Goodwin," she said when she saw me. I should have known Wolfe would send his favorite provocation. "Strictly professional," I said. "Though if you're buying lunch, I could be persuaded to grief counseling." She laughed, sharp, metallic. "You think I'm upset about George Latham? He was a patron, not a passion." "Hanratty seemed passionate enough about his finances," I said. "Maybe too much." Her fork paused mid-air. "What's that supposed to mean?" "That Latham was funneling money through a shell company, the kind people use when they want their names off the wiring diagram." She dabbed her lips delicately. "Men die, Mr. Goodwin. Money simply changes hands." I leaned in. "Sometimes it changes lives first." Her eyes flashed. Then she smiled too sweetly. "Sometimes money kills more cleanly than current." That line could have been printed on Wolfe's business cards. When she left, the check was paid, and the air smelled faintly of expensive perfume and danger. Wolfe had told me not to flirt. He hadn't said anything about fencing. Following a hunch that smelled faintly of gin, I dropped by the Clover Bar, Hanratty's old watering hole. The bartender, a thick-necked philosopher with more memory than hair, remembered the inventor vividly. "Used to come here with Latham," he said, polishing a glass. "They'd argue like a married couple. Money, patents, genius, same thing far as I could tell." "Who usually won?" I asked. He snorted. "Nobody. Last time they were here, Hanratty yelled, 'If you die, I own you.' Real dramatic." Latham laughed it off. Then he picked up the tab. His way of winning. I ordered a club soda to keep the story flowing. "That was how long before the accident?" 3 nights. "Anybody else hear it?" "Half the bar. You think I'd forget a line like that?" I slipped him a bill for the memory service. Outside, the evening lights came on like witnesses. If Latham's widow inherited anything, it wasn't the patents. Those had probably gone straight into Hanratty's greedy little hands the minute Latham's heart stopped beating. That meant motive wasn't money anymore. It was ownership. And in this business, owning a man can be more profitable than loving him. Paula Dane's building looked like it charged rent by the column inch. Her convertible sat out front, top down, gleaming like a red promise. I might have walked past, except the colour caught me, a flash of crimson on the passenger seat. A silk handkerchief. Crimson corner, faint burn mark, and the kind of monogram that whispers expensive taste. Paula didn't smoke. Not the type to risk ash on silk. I glanced around, then picked it up and pocketed it. The scent matched her perfume from the diner, though lighter, as if mixed with fear. If she'd been there at midnight, as Piper had hinted. Then that handkerchief had just joined the conversation. Quietly, but with style. I shut the car door softly and muttered, "Either she's careless, or someone's setting her up." In either case, the spark had found its next wire. When I got back, Wolfe was in his natural habitat, chair, beer, and Fritz hovering with silent disapproval over his 5th portion of sauerbraten. I laid out my haul, the shell company, the quarrel, and Paula's crimson souvenir. Wolfe didn't interrupt, just breathed heavily through the part about lunch. Then I mentioned the burn mark. His eyes opened. "Combustion," he murmured, "is never accidental, whether of wires or of hearts." I waited. He looked up at me, the faintest gleam in his eyes. "Archie, tomorrow we shall reverse the current. Prepare for visitors." That was Wolfe's way of saying the case was heating up. And when Wolfe starts talking about electricity, someone's bound to get shocked. There are 3 certainties in life at the brownstone. Wolfe at his desk, Fritz in the kitchen, and me somewhere between the two, balancing the checkbook and my sense of humour. That evening, The air was rich with pheasant and argument. Fritz was grumbling from the dining room archway, waving a spoon like a weapon. "Crime," he declared, "interrupts digestion. You will both die of nerves." "Poi," Wolfe said. "Good food sustains good logic." That was Wolfe's way of saying the case wasn't going to solve itself on an empty stomach. We ate in companionable silence, his version of it, anyway, until he leaned back, wiped his fingers with surgical precision, and said, "Names, Archie." I fetched the notebook. Wolfe began laying them out across the table like a general arranging troops: Hanratty, Dane, Quinn, Piper. His finger tapped the air after each one. "Each has a motive," he mused. "Each has an alibi. But alibis, like insulation, are only as good as the material used." I said, "Meaning one of them's already melting." He grunted, "Meaning one of them is lying." And just like that, dessert was postponed for murder. It's not often Wolfe leaves his chair, but that night he paced, a sure sign that civilization was in peril. I sat with my typewriter, recording every statement from the previous day, while he muttered to himself about the geometry of deceit. He was mapping alibis on a notepad, his handwriting neat enough to shame architects. Hanratty was at his workshop, he recited. Paula Dane left the studio before midnight. Sergeant Piper claims to have locked the doors. And Quinn. He stopped, pen hovering. I peered over the desk. "Looks like you're sketching a subway map. What's the route?" "The route," he said grimly, "is circular. Each account supports the next. Too neat, like cables arranged to fool the eye." I leaned back. "You're saying someone's wired this whole thing for pretty patterns?" "Precisely. And symmetry, Archie, is the hallmark of deceit. Truth rarely bothers to be elegant." He drew one final line, then froze mid-word. His lips thinned. "Quinn," he murmured. "He was too certain." I raised a brow. "About what?" "About everything." That didn't narrow it much, but when Wolfe starts sounding like a thundercloud trying to solve geometry, you don't interrupt. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, beer within reach and lecture mode engaged. "Electricity," he began, "is merely disciplined lightning, useful until liberated by malice." I said, "Meaning somebody aimed the thunderbolt?" He eyed me. "You will never resist vulgar paraphrase." "Not while it's accurate," I told him. He sighed. "The act required not brute force but intellect, knowledge of circuitry and timing. Our culprit possessed both." "So, who fits the bill? Hanratty the genius, Paula the opportunist, Quinn the technician, or Piper the nervous night watchman?" "Possibly none. Possibly all." "That's comforting," I said. "I'll sleep better knowing we're surrounded by geniuses." He ignored me and continued. "The motive, however, was not money alone. It was pride, scientific vanity, wounded perhaps, or betrayed. To sabotage a device at the moment of triumph demands not greed, but vengeance wrapped in intellect." "Translation," I said. "Somebody smart lost their temper." Wolfe's eyes flickered toward me. "Temper is too crude." This was a deliberate expression of superiority. I nodded, then mentioned I'd seen Quinn hovering by the fuse box the day before, fiddling with something he shouldn't. Wolfe's eyes closed, not in weariness, but concentration. "Yes," he said softly. "The fuse, always the most revealing part of a circuit." Morning brought coffee, toast, and bad news. I made my usual round of phone calls, and by the time Fritz came in with a fresh cup, my mood was blacker than Wolfe's suit. "The studio just called," I said. "Ralph Quinn hasn't shown up." Wolfe was midway through buttering his muffin. Inconvenient. More than that. "His landlady says his bed wasn't slept in. Nobody's seen him since yesterday." Wolfe's knife paused mid-air. "So, the current has found its path to ground." "Meaning what?" I asked. "Meaning the weakest conductor has burned out, or been removed." That was Wolfe's poetic way of saying someone had silenced Quinn. I didn't wait for a lecture on Ohm's law. I grabbed my hat and gun. Where? Wolfe asked. Out, I said, before Kramer claims him for the obituary page. He lifted his cup. Do be quick, Archie. If the man is dead, I should like the body fresh. That was my cue to leave, preferably before breakfast turned into autopsy. By the time I hit the door, the house felt charged. Even Fritz's clattering in the kitchen had a nervous rhythm. Wolfe called after me, his voice low and firm. Locate Quinn before Kramer does. That was an order, not a request. I turned the knob, glancing back once. The orchids upstairs trembled in the draught, as if the air itself knew trouble was brewing. Funny how quiet a house can get when someone disappears into the dark with the truth. And if Wolfe was right, Ralph Quinn had just taken the secret straight into the current. When you've been around as much death as I have, you learn the difference between a bad morning and a rotten one. This was the latter. I'd planned to swing by the studio, swap a few sarcastic remarks, and maybe squeeze another statement out of Ralph Quinn. Instead, I met a line of squad cars and Inspector Kramer looking like he'd eaten a lemon and lost the argument. Late to the party, Goodwin, he said. Your pal Quinn decided to clock out early. I looked past him. The smell hit first, carbon monoxide and cheap varnish with a garnish of tragedy. Quinn was slumped near his workbench, pale, peaceful, and completely wrong for the part of a suicide. Kramer jabbed a thumb toward the gas heater. Open valve, no note, classic. Sure, I said. Except Quinn wasn't the classic type. He was the jittery, guilty, too careful type. Kramer scowled. You think he had help? I think he had company. He didn't like that. He never does when I sound confident. Some mornings you can smell murder even before the report's filed, and this one reeked of it. I took my time looking around while Kramer barked orders. The gas line was open wide, the window cracked just enough to look like an afterthought, and Quinn's hands, clean as a minister's conscience. Too clean for a man who supposedly fixed his own death. His coffee mug sat nearby. I lifted it, sniffed. Varnish. Not much. Just enough to ruin your morning brew and possibly your lungs. Put that down, Kramer growled. I'm being delicate, I said. Wouldn't want to smudge your masterpiece. He grunted. You and Wolfe always got to play the smart guys. Not play, Inspector. It's full-time employment. He turned away before I could grin, which was a shame. Then I saw it. A faint smear of red on the control panel near the switchboard. Not rust, not blood. Paint. That exact shade of crimson that had flooded the studio the night Latham died. Hey, Kramer, I called. You ever see a corpse redecorate? He gave me the kind of look that would have sent lesser men to confession. Out, he said, before I make you a suspect. I went. But I took my thoughts with me, and one vivid image, that streak of red, glowing like a fingerprint from the devil himself. I made it back to the brownstone just in time to drop my hat and reach for the phone, but Wolfe beat me to the punch, figuratively and otherwise. Mr. Quinn, he said, without opening his eyes, is dead. I froze. You been wiretapping homicide, or just upgraded to clairvoyance? Neither, he said calmly. The man was too nervous to survive his conscience. His death was inevitable. I sat down. You could have warned him. Warn him? Wolfe's eyes opened now, glinting like dark glass. He was already marked, by guilt or by someone who found it convenient to end it. Do not overestimate the virtue of remorse. I stared. You sure you're not getting tips from the Oracle of Delphi? Archie, he said. The sequence of events was obvious to anyone with the decency to think, meaning you. Precisely. It wasn't telepathy. It was Wolfe being Wolfe, predicting human weakness with all the compassion of a chess player for a pawn. And for the record, I still checked the evening papers to make sure he was right. If the doorbell had personality, it would have sounded offended. Kramer barged in 5 minutes later, looking like thunder wearing a badge. "You knew," he barked, "before we did. How the hell?" "Inductive inevitability," Wolfe said smoothly. "You might try it sometime, Inspector. It prevents embarrassment." Kramer's fist hit the arm of the chair hard enough to make Fritz flinch from the kitchen. "You think you're funny? A man's dead, Wolfe." "Yes," Wolfe replied. "Another. How inconvenient for your statistics." I sat there enjoying the show. Kramer in full storm mode, Wolfe immovable as granite. It was better than dinner theatre. "You can't just sit here spouting philosophy," Kramer snapped. "Quinn's suicide closes the case." Wolfe raised one eyebrow. "It closes nothing. His death merely insulates the murderer from you." That hit Kramer square. "You saying someone helped him die?" "I'm saying," Wolfe said, "that Quinn's death is the killer's insurance policy, a short circuit to truth." I saw it then, the flicker in Wolfe's eyes that meant he'd spotted the pattern. "The murderer," he continued, "wagers on my mechanical ignorance." He lifted his beer, studied the bubbles, and added softly, "A costly mistake." Kramer didn't get it yet. I did. Later that evening, I laid the photos from the workshop across Wolfe's desk. He gave them a brief, disdainful glance, like a man judging cheap wallpaper, then stopped cold. "There," he said, "on the switch housing." I leaned in. A faint residue of crimson paint shimmered under the lamp. "Same color from the demonstration," I said. "But why?" "Cosmetic deceit," Wolfe murmured. "The killer replaced the fatal component with an imitation after its purpose was served. Paint conceals the substitution." "So they dressed up the dummy to look dangerous," I said. "Precisely. A charade for the police. While they admired the surface, the substance vanished." He leaned back, eyes narrowing. "The deceit is not technical, it is theatrical. Someone who understands appearance far better than electricity." That ruled out Hanratty the inventor. That left someone who lived for headlines and presentation. Wolfe said it before I could. "Vanity leaves fingerprints brighter than blood." I packed the photos. "Meaning?" "Meaning, Archie," he said. "Our culprit painted their own guilt and believed it art." Night settled like a damp shroud over Manhattan. I closed the windows. Wolfe hated the city noise sneaking in. He sat beneath the lamplight, motionless, eyes half-lidded, as if listening to something only he could hear. "The killer," he said finally, "understands machines, but not men." I knew that tone. It was the sound before the storm, the calm before Wolfe flipped the switch. "Tomorrow," he said, "we gather them." I didn't ask who them meant. When Wolfe says gather, it usually ends with someone confessing or collapsing. And this time, I could almost feel the voltage building. There are few things rarer than silence in the brownstone that isn't accompanied by digestion. That evening, however, Fritz's trout went cold and unadmired on the dining table, while Wolfe brooded at his desk, surrounded by blueprints, diagrams, and untouched beer. He muttered to himself, which was never a good sign. "Reversal of polarity and propriety," he said, as though the two shared equal tragedy. I paced. The air in the office had that tight, humming stillness you feel before a thunderstorm, or before Wolfe detonates with an idea. Fritz peeked in once, holding a platter like a peace offering. "The trout, Mr. Wolfe." "Remove it," Wolfe thundered. "I cannot dine amid intellectual indigestion." That was my cue to stay quiet and keep breathing. Finally, his eyes lifted and his lips twitched, the expression Wolfe uses when his brain has just snapped the final wire into place. "They switched not wires, Archie," he said slowly, "but positions." That sentence hummed in the room like live current. I didn't yet know what it meant, but the way he said it made me wish I'd worn rubber soles. When Wolfe finally speaks in full paragraphs again, you listen. I was halfway through lighting a cigarette when he said, Mr. Latham was not killed by an electrical device. He was killed by an arrangement. I raised an eyebrow. Murder by furniture placement. His glare could have stripped varnish. Do not be obtuse. The demonstration was designed to channel current through a human conduit. The financier was meant to throw the switch, but someone rewired the pattern, physically, not mechanically, so the current would pass through him alone. I whistled. So you're saying he wasn't just at the wrong place at the wrong time? He was the circuit. Precisely. An organism misused as a conductor. Elegant, hideous symmetry. Sounds like murder by seating plan, I said. We should hire a decorator. He ignored me, which was confirmation I'd struck near the truth. The others were positioned to complete a safe circuit, he continued. He alone bore the surge. The killer reversed polarity and, metaphorically, justice. I said, that's poetic, coming from a man who thinks poetry is inefficient speech. He grunted. Poetry and homicide share a principle, Archie. They both demand precision. The design was electrical, he added, eyes glinting. But the motive was human. And in Wolfe's book, that's when things really start to sizzle. Once Wolfe gets rolling, the only way to stop him is a fire alarm. Or Fritz yelling, dessert. Neither was available. The motive, Wolfe said, was not pecuniary. It was vengeance disguised as intellect. Someone felt robbed, not of property, but of creation. I leaned back. You're talking about Paula Dane. She's got ambition wired straight to the mains. I am talking, Wolfe said sharply, about theft of the mind. That shut me up for 3 whole seconds. He continued, the financier profited from ideas not his own. To the injured creator, monetary compensation is irrelevant. Retribution becomes aesthetic. Neat, I said. A murder as revenge for plagiarism. You could patent that. He ignored me, pacing now, a rare treat. Quinn's death proves the pattern. He was a man divided between loyalty and terror. He knew too much and trusted the killer too long. Hence, the perfect disposal. Guilt arranged as suicide. I tapped my pen. You think guilt killed him twice? Once in his head, once in his garage. Wolfe's gaze cut to me. A man does not die twice from guilt, Archie. Once in conscience, once in contrivance. I wrote it down, not because it made sense yet, but because when Wolfe gets philosophical, it usually means he's about to get murderous, in a purely intellectual way, of course. When Wolfe announces a gathering, the city trembles, mostly because half of it has to fit into our office. He leaned back and said, Archie, summon them. 8 o'clock precisely. All of them, I asked. Yes, promptness is the courtesy of the guilty. That line deserved framing. I got on the phone. Giles, Hanratty answered first, muttering about, genius interrupted. Paula Dane made me repeat the time twice, her voice honey dipped in defiance. Sergeant Piper growled something about not liking parlours. Mrs. Latham, cool as silver, said only, of course. By the time I was done, I felt like the maitre d' at a restaurant that served subpoenas instead of soup. Wolfe nodded, satisfied. Ensure no one touches the lighting controls in my office. If illumination is required, I will provide it. Planning a light show? I asked. Planning clarity, he said. Light, Archie, is the only disinfectant strong enough for deceit. I grinned. Sounds like the brightest party in town, unless somebody kills the lights again. He gave me a look that suggested I might be next on that list. It was going to be one of those nights, the kind that starts with order and ends with combustion. By 7:30, the brownstone was a stage waiting for the play to start. The orchids upstairs had closed for the night. The air smelled faintly of ozone from Fritz's overzealous polishing, and Wolfe sat like a mountain in a suit, eyes half-lidded, fingers steepled. I set out chairs, 4 of them, and checked the gun in my drawer. Not because I expected a shootout, but because I've learned that truth can be just as loud. The clock ticked, the city murmured outside, and for once I felt the weight of Wolfe's silence. It wasn't laziness. It was focus, coiled and waiting. Finally, he spoke. Archie, tonight we reverse not electricity, but deceit. That had the sound of scripture, and I said so. He opened one eye. Blasphemy has its place if it serves precision. I nodded. Then precision's about to have a busy night. He didn't smile, but there was the faintest hum in the room, the mental equivalent of live current. Somewhere between trout, treachery, and telephones, Wolfe had found the final connection. And if history was any guide, by the time the clock struck 8, someone was going to find themselves unplugged, permanently. By 8 o'clock, Wolfe's office looked less like a detective's lair and more like a courtroom run by a horticulturist. The orchids glowed in their cases like silent witnesses, while the suspects trickled in one by one, shedding civility at the threshold. Paula Dane came first, glittering with perfume and panic. Hanratty followed, all sweat and genius, his tie strangling him by inches. Mrs. Latham glided in behind them, dressed in morning silk and stock market calm. And then came Kramer, dragging suspicion behind him like a badge of honor. Wolfe barely looked up. "Be seated," he said, with all the warmth of an ice floe. I'd cleared the chairs myself, leaving just enough distance between Wolfe and the accused to make a good photograph, if anyone had survived to take one. When the room had settled into that tense, expectant quiet, Wolfe cultivates better than orchids. He finally spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he intoned, "we shall now reverse the current of deceit." I dimmed the lights at his nod. The room sank into shadow and anticipation, and for once, I was glad the switch was on my side of the desk. Wolfe hates props. He considers them theatrical and undignified, which is why the sight of a small mock-up of the crimson switch sitting on his desk nearly made me applaud. "This," Wolfe announced, "is a facsimile of the device used at the fatal demonstration. Harmless for our purposes, though it might yet illuminate ignorance." He gestured for me to flip a lever. A faint glow spread across the surface, painting the room with dull amber. "The original circuit," he continued, "was designed for demonstration. Energy was to travel through a controlled loop, safe, elegant, unremarkable. But one adjustment, one deliberate reversal of polarity, redirected the current. Instead of passing harmlessly through the apparatus, it sought the nearest human conductor. Mr. Latham, standing where he did, completed the design, fatally." Hanratty shifted in his chair, muttering something about idiotic tampering. Paula smoothed her skirt with trembling fingers. Kramer frowned. "All right, so someone flipped a wire. What's this, science class?" Wolfe's tone could have cut marble. "No, Inspector, this is the anatomy of intention." He paused, letting the silence thicken. Then, softly, "One among you knew exactly what hue death would wear." I didn't know what was coming, but I could feel the current building. Wolfe was circling the moment like a cat around a birdcage. He spoke of conductors and conscience, of invention and vanity, of how only one person could have altered the wiring without detection. Paula Dane's perfume arrived before her voice. "That's absurd," she burst out. "The switch was perfectly safe. I can never forget that shade of red. It was magnificent before it went dark." The air froze solid. Even the orchids seemed to stop breathing. Kramer and I locked eyes. He mouthed, "Got her." Wolfe allowed himself the faintest smile. "Indeed, Miss Dane, the red light was never meant to appear." She blinked, confused. "What?" "It was a cosmetic conceit," he said, his voice quiet and deadly. "Added to disguise the reversed polarity. No one saw it glow crimson, except the person who arranged it so." Her hand went to her throat. The sound that came out was half a gasp, half a denial. Hanratty swore softly under his breath. Mrs. Latham merely closed her eyes, as if the market had just crashed again. Wolfe folded his hands. "You have just confessed by admiration, Miss Dane. The colour you recall was visible only to the murderer. And this time, Even the inspector didn't interrupt. Wolfe leaned forward, his voice soft but edged like a scalpel. You believed yourself wronged, Miss Dane. Your genius overlooked, your contribution dismissed. You watched men take credit for the brilliance you polished into spectacle. Paula's face hardened. I gave that invention its soul. Latham only financed it. Hanratty built the body, but You completed it, Wolfe interrupted. As you completed its destruction. She straightened in her chair. You think I'd kill for a patent? No, Wolfe said. For recognition. You are a creature of light, Miss Dane. Spotlight, flashbulb, acclaim. When Latham reneged on his promise to make your name public, you conceived a reversal most poetic. You painted the false switch, ensuring it would glow in your chosen color, the color of your vengeance. Her breath hitched. You can't prove. Proof is redundant, Wolfe said. When logic suffices, the crimson pigment was traced to your design kit. Quinn discovered your tampering, thus his second and final death, and you, in your vanity, left the residue that betrayed you. The silence was electric. Finally, she broke. He promised me everything, she cried, voice cracking, and left me with nothing. Kramer moved in, but Wolfe raised a hand. Let her finish, Inspector. She has wired her own confession. Paula slumped forward, shaking. I didn't mean to kill him. I only wanted him to see, to feel, what it's like to be used. Wolfe's tone was almost pitying. And so you illuminated him, Miss Dane. Permanently. Kramer's cuffs clicked shut with the finality of a closing circuit. Press girls and poison wires, he muttered. That's a headline I won't have to read twice. Paula Dane didn't resist. She just stared at the switch replica on Wolfe's desk, its faint amber glow mocking her. Wolfe leaned back, closing his eyes. Ambition without ballast, he said softly, is the shortest route to self-immolation. Kramer shot me a look. You ever get tired of him talking like a college professor? Never, I said. He makes my job sound intellectual. When they'd gone, the office felt oddly peaceful. Fritz appeared, bearing the evening's consolation prize, a tray with beer for Wolfe and coffee for me. I handed Wolfe his glass. So, boss, case closed? He opened one eye. No, Archie. Case corrected. The current is once more properly grounded. I took that to mean he was ready for his beer, and I was dismissed. It was the kind of ending only Wolfe could engineer. Neat, final, and humming faintly with satisfaction. And as I watched the orchids gleam under the lamplight, I had to admit, nobody handles murder quite like Nero Wolfe. Peace at the brownstone is a tricky thing. It doesn't come naturally. It has to be rebuilt, like Fritz's dining table after an argument between logic and homicide. The city outside still hummed with late traffic, but inside, order had been restored with silver trays and silent judgment. Fritz was polishing the cutlery, like a priest restoring relics after blasphemy. The orchids glistened. Under lamplight, Wolfe's desk gleamed again, and the great man himself was barricaded behind it. Fingers tented, lips pursed, and temper sealed. He'd barred all phone calls announcing, "The Republic may totter, but I shall not." That meant no interruptions, not even from civilization. I leaned against the doorway. You know, that last case almost made you exercise. He glared up from his beer glass. Impertinence is not wit, Archie. Maybe not, I said, but it's closer than a heart attack. He ignored me, which is Wolfe's version of surrender. The storm had passed, but its echo still lingered. The faint crackle of triumph, pride, and unspoken exhaustion. When Wolfe refuses the world, it's not for rest. It's for digestion, mental and otherwise. And tonight, both kinds were overdue. Dinner arrived on schedule. Because in our household, meals are sacred and crime waits. Fritz had outdone himself with pheasant in brandy sauce, roasted to the exact degree of moral perfection. Wolfe raised his fork, inspected the dish as though it were evidence, and said, "Acceptable." Fritz sniffed, wounded but professional. "If you do not wish for excellence, sir, you may hire a cook. I wish, Wolfe said, for consistency. That exchange, like most domestic wars here, ended in Fritz's favour when Wolfe took the second bite and closed his eyes. I ate mine faster, mostly to beat the lecture that usually followed the third sip of wine. Sure enough, he launched into one. Food and truth, Wolfe announced, share a principle. They must be served neither too hot nor too cold. In both, timing determines justice. I said, then tonight's dinner was practically a confession. He frowned. Explain. Well, I said, Paula Dane served hers hot. You served yours cold. And the pheasant, thank Fritz, was just right. Wolfe gave me the kind of look that usually precedes a grunt of disapproval or a philosophical expansion. I got both. Temper, he said, is the enemy of both art and digestion. I grinned. Still, if we're ranking tonight's hot dishes, I'd say the pheasant barely edged out Paula Dane's temper. That earned me silence, which in this house counts as applause. After dinner came the debrief, a ritual almost as rigid as the menu, coffee on the side table, beer for Wolfe, and a fresh notebook for me. He spoke slowly, the way he does when mentally dismantling a corpse and a motive in the same breath. A case of ironies, Archie. Electricity, a tool of illumination, used for murder. Intellect turned to arrogance, vanity masquerading as vision. I sipped my coffee. And you, of course, saving civilization from bad wiring. He ignored that. Mr. Quinn's death, he went on, was predictable. A conscience that wavers is like a frayed wire, destined to burn out. Meaning you knew it would happen, I asked. Meaning, Wolfe said. Entropy is inevitable. That's his version of yes. Before I could poke him further, Fritz appeared in the doorway, holding the radio dial like a weapon. Shall I turn on the news, sir? They say the city— No! Wolfe thundered. Let New York keep its noise. This house is sovereign territory. Fritz retreated like a man defending neutrality. Wolfe leaned back, sighing. Archie, unplug it, lest the city leak in again. I did, grinning. For Wolfe, that was the closest he'd ever come to patriotism. Later, I was filing notes when Wolfe spoke again, his voice floating over the rustle of paper. Archie, he said, we shall take no more clients for a week. That's rich, I said. I was about to install a crimson switch right here on the wall. One flip and you'd accept a case. It'd save time. He closed his eyes, the ghost of a smile flickering like an old filament. Nonsense. Practical nonsense, I said. Color-coded even. Red for murder, green for sanity. You possess neither the temperament nor the artistry for invention. Maybe not, I said. But I've got ulcers. He grunted, a sound that could have meant anything from amusement to mild homicide. I marked the file closed, wondering if this time it would stay that way longer than a week. From across the room, Wolfe murmured, The trouble with electricity, Archie, is that it tempts fools to think they command lightning. And the trouble with detectives, I said, is that they think they do. He didn't answer, which meant I'd scored. Wolfe's final grunt echoed across the room, a sound so layered it might have been translated 3 ways: confession, contempt, and faint approval. He raised his beer, the glass catching the lamplight like a verdict. The orchids swayed gently above, their petals glimmering, silent as always, the perfect jury. Outside, Manhattan hummed its endless tune of crime and commerce, but inside, the current had finally stopped. And if you're wondering where it stopped, well, it ended where it always does, right at Nero Wolfe's desk. When the city quiets and the last headline fades, the brownstone still breathes with the scent of orchids and justice. Wolfe has returned to his chair, beer in hand, his mind already building walls between reason and regret. Fritz hums in the kitchen, and somewhere beyond the window, New York hums with 1,000 unsolved riddles. In the end, it wasn't electricity that killed. It was pride, disguised as genius. Every wire, every spark, led back to a human heart unwilling to admit defeat. But tell me, do you believe ambition can ever be innocent? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Sometimes, even the brightest minds can burn in their own light.